Hello and welcome. Thanks everyone for giving up your Sunday afternoon for this program. I'm really excited about it. Welcome to TEDx Chicago. This is a book reading by a member of our congregation and a longtime and good friend of mine, Liz Shulman, who's just published the book, A Good Jewish Girl, A Jerusalem Love Story Gone Bad. And it is a collection of her essays written over a number of years dealing with her changing and evolving and conflicting relationship with Israel and Zionism. And I'll let Liz say more about the book before she reads some sections for us and we engage in conversation. Just to let you know about the format, we'll begin with a few opening remarks from Liz, and then she'll read two excerpts from her book, and then she and I will engage in conversation. But I want to leave time for a question and answer and conversation with the group as well. So you can feel free to uh, put questions in the chat, or when we get to the point in the session, we can have folks raise their hand to unmute and ask their questions out loud. But it would be nice to engage in group conversation as part of our program. And we're all going to do that within an hour. So just very briefly, I've known Liz for many, many years. She was a congregant of mine in my former congregation, Jewish Reconstructionist congregation, and has been at Tzedek Chicago pretty much from the very beginning. And I've been following her work as a writer for many, many years as well. And in fact, was familiar with some of the essays that she had published online before they were put together as an anthology in a book. Liz is, in addition to being a writer, is a teacher, a longtime public school teacher, and she's been for many years at Evanston Township High School, where she teaches English literature, I believe. Is that
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
English, and also is adjunct faculty at Northwestern University. With no further ado, I'll turn things over to Liz, and again, thank her and all of you for being here today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Brant, and thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to TEDx Chicago for hosting this. I've attended other book talks at TEDx, and I used to think, wow, if I publish a book someday, I hope that I can do a book reading. So I'm really honored to be here, and thank you all for coming. Um, so basically, this book is my effort to narrate through personal stories my process of separating Zionism from Judaism. Um, Most of the essays take place in the 1990s when I was living in Jerusalem as a grad student at Hebrew University. Um, and is about the relationships with the people that I had when I was living there. Many who still in touch with now, many years later. More than that, it's also about what it means to separate from an ideology. Mine just happened to be Zionism. Um, to separate from an ideology, to have a shift in your worldview, a paradigm shift, something that happens that causes you to think about the world in a different way. The essays are all connected by that theme. And I also wanted to show that that the personal and the political is incredibly intertwined, for better or for worse. Um, so here's the book. Um, I'm going to read two excerpts. The first one is from the preface and is basically about my first trip to Jerusalem in 1986 when I was 16 years old and completely in love with the country. So I will read that, and then I will read just a short part from the first chapter, and then we'll talk. It was 1986. I was 16 and on my first trip to Jerusalem. I stood in front of Apple Pizza on Lunt Street near Ben Yehuda's pedestrian mall, swaying to Naomi Shemer's 1967 song, Jerusalem of Gold, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, with other young teens in Jerusalem on an 8-week high school program. The song was being played on a boombox, and I sang along with other American Jews who had, like me, fallen in love with the city. Rather than hold a lighter up to the music, we held each other's waists and gave a little extra squeeze for those we had crushes on. We were in love with Jerusalem and with each other too, as our hips moved to the music, our feet firmly planted on the limestone street. Shemer's famous ballad, commissioned by the mayor of Jerusalem at the time, Teddy Kollek, was first performed at an Israeli song festival the night after Israel's Independence Day on May 15th, 1967, just 3 weeks before Israel's Six-Day War. After the war, Shemer added a final verse about capturing the city, and the song became a nationalistic war cry of the Israel Defense Forces, a celebration of Jerusalem's reunification when Israel took the Old City and East Jerusalem. In many ways, the whole notion of Israel is a nationalistic war cry. Its ongoing occupation and genocide, settler expansion, colonization, and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. As the scholar Ilan Pape writes in The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, he also wrote the foreword to this book. Israel's goal since the 1882 First Zionist Congress was, and still is, to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. The Israeli government still goes to great and exorbitantly expensive lengths to get young Jews to love Israel, especially young Jews in the United States. No one questioned Israel's policies towards Palestinians when I was on the 8-week summer program in 1986. We talked about Israel as a miracle that had defied the odds against it. Mostly, we talked about love. In a postcard I sent to my parents in Chicago that summer in 1986, I wrote about Jerusalem's beauty. It was like nowhere I'd ever seen. Postcards just don't do the city justice, I wrote. The golden hue everywhere makes me feel that I've come home. The essays in this collection are my attempt to understand how the larger historical and political context of Israel and Palestine has shaped and divided my life. I was taught at an early age to think critically, to question the status quo, and to challenge others when I felt an injustice. Yet I was at the same time also trained to block out possible dissent. I knew intuitively, perhaps without language, never to ask about Israel's motives. When I did start to question and subsequently began to publish essays about my changing relationship with Israel, most of all was the fear of a rupture between my parents and me. When I became critical of Israel, I worried that my parents, the very people who taught me to think critically, would never forgive me. I feared it was as though I had turned on them like a zombie eating its own flesh, the very flesh that had created me. Zionism's heartstrings had a strong pull. On the same summer trip in 1986, several of us sang Shemer's song spontaneously on top of Masada after hiking up the mountain at sunrise, a rite of passage for young Zionists who visit Israel. We chanted the lyrics, "If I forget thee, golden city, Jerusalem of gold," while the sun cast gold, pink, and orange streaks across the horizon. The sky looked like Homer's dawn in the Odyssey, spreading her rose-red fingers. A few of us ran off as others carried the tune, and we made out, pressing ourselves against the stone ruins. In between our kisses, leaning on the ancient rock, we whispered, "If I forget thee," unclear at the time if these words were meant for each other or for our beloved Golden Jerusalem. Even when we were 90 minutes away in the desert, we felt a love for Jerusalem, like the kind that Joan Didion feels for New York City in her famous essay, Goodbye to All That. I mean, I was in love with the city, she confesses, the way you love the first person who touches you and never love anyone quite that way again. I can't remember the name of the guy I made out with on top of Masada, but I have etched into my memory every nook and crevice of Jerusalem that I stepped on and played in when I was 16. This was Zionism's plan, of course, to get young Zionists like me to fall in love unconditionally with the tiny country. Their efforts succeeded. We fell in line like good soldiers. We were expected to grow up and donate money, plant trees, which I did as a child with my allowance money, buy homes, visit often, perhaps lose our virginity in the Holy Land if we hadn't already at the Zionist socialist camp we attended in the US, and later marry a Jew, have kids, maybe make Aliyah, and hope for the same things for our Jewish children. Loving Israel was effortless, uncomplicated, unconditional, different from loving any other country in the world. My non-Jewish friends who professed their love for America, for example, loved it in a way that was different from my romance with Israel. They teased that I talked about Israel like it was my lover. I scoffed at them, though they were right. Another postcard I sent to my parents in 1986 did sound as though Jerusalem and I were in love. Jerusalem and I are getting along just fine, I wrote, as though we were a married couple who'd been together for decades. It was so much more than simply loving one's country, and you could only understand if you too were both Zionist and Jewish. Besides, we developed a way of being together with private jokes and experiences from our trip. We remembered Elon, the hot soldier many of us wanted to make out with, but who only made out with Jackie, who annoyed us because she was so pretty. Or Shlomo, the bald tour guide who protected us on the bus with his M16. And the funny way he'd get mad trying to get us to shut up, his M16 rattling against his thigh as he told us Israel's one-sided history from the comfort of our air-conditioned bus. None of us disputed anything we learned on that trip. We were an infatuated fugue state with the nation state, and we were surrounded by people who felt the same. So that's from the preface, and then I'm just going to read a very short part from the first chapter, which is the title chapter of the book called Good Jewish Girl. And this is towards the end of the chapter. I don't know if I can describe the feeling that arrives when you realize that what you used to believe, you no longer believe. It's a feeling that can make you nauseous and unsteady. Later, you realize some of the nausea was because you had an existential crisis. I kept going back and deeper too, beyond East Jerusalem into Palestinian villages in the West Bank. Decades later, I realized that simply spending time in these areas and getting to know Palestinian people was enough to turn me into a bad Jewish girl. When you're a good Jewish girl, you're taught to stay away from these neighborhoods. You've been told by everyone around you that they're dangerous and that bad people live there. This included Damascus Gate on the northern side of the old city, an area that is a center of Palestinian cultural life. If you're a good Jewish girl, you know that you should only enter at Jaffa Gate on the western side of the old city, which you can take directly into the Jewish quarter. You can get to the entrance of the Shuk easily from Jaffa Gate too. Today, promenades exist where people gather and visit areas that seamlessly connect Jaffa Gate to West Jerusalem, further strengthening Israel's claim to the old city. Once I began spending time in East Jerusalem and ventured deeper in the West Bank, I began reading about Israel and Palestine, trying to understand what I had experienced, giving my mind a chance to catch up with my body. When I read Edward Said's 1979 essay, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims, a friend said I was reading a terrorist. Yet in his essay, Said does more than my community did. I was never around Jews growing up who expressed a Palestinian point of view. Instead, I was told they did not exist. In his essay, Said sees how much Israel means to the Jews, despite what it has meant for Palestinians. Not only does he present Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, he also understands Zionism from the standpoint of Zionists. I know as well as any educated non-Jew can know what anti-Semitism has meant for the Jews, especially in this century, Said writes. Consequently, I can understand the intertwined terror and the exaltation out of which Zionism has been nourished. And I think I can at least grasp the meaning of Israel for Jews. But Said can also see and feel other things, he continues, that complicate matters considerably, that cause me also to focus on Zionism's other aspects. Once I saw Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, as Said presents it, it was as though my eyes had come into focus after a lifetime of blurry vision. But Said's Palestinian, so he's biased, my Jewish friends told me. So I read Ilan Pappé's Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine in Israeli. He's Israeli and has similar views, I told them. Pape spent an enormous amount of time in the Israeli archives gathering his research, I told them. But he left Israel, they stabbed back. He's self-hating, they said. He's anti-Semitic, they said. The friendships, of course, would end. But in the demise of these relationships, I realized the impossibility of competing with a myth. I eventually understood that nothing I ever said would change the minds of most of my Jewish friends. Things are different today. Jewish communities in the US are fed up with Israeli politics shifting to the right and with Israel's mistreatment of its Palestinian population. Yet at the time, reading these books made me sick because I learned that there had always been books about Palestine, that there had always been people writing and talking about Palestine. And what does it say about my community that the word Palestine or Palestinian and all these books written about Palestinian history never came up? I loved being Jewish, and so it became crucial that I find my own way out of Zionism through my Jewish identity, that I decide what had to be discarded and what could be preserved as most vital to my identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I'm going to see if I can get us on multi-speaker here. No. Okay. We'll just go back to gallery view. Okay. So, I have some uh, questions I'd love to pose and love to engage in conversation. If folks have any questions they'd like to ask Liz, please feel free to put them in the chat, or when she and I are done, we can open things up as well. So I guess my first question is, how would you describe your relationship to Israel and to Jerusalem now? You did a great job in describing it in the book of that love affair from when you were younger and how that evolved. But I'm asking, like right now, at this very moment, how would you describe that relationship? And I'll just finish by saying I could relate to much of what you wrote. I especially, the feelings of loving a city like Jerusalem and loving a country, and now realizing that that love was really indoctrination. It was indoctrinated love. Um, and I'm fascinated by when people talk about love for a country. What does that mean? I can understand, Hannah Arendt once really famously wrote when she was corresponding with Gershom Scholem, that she says, I don't understand love for a country or a people. I understand love for people. Like that I understand, but what does it mean to love a country? So, all of that to say, I'm very interested in hearing what your relationship with the country is like now at this point in time.
Uh, I think it's a sick, it's sick, I'm sickened. I mean, especially now. I mean, this book was written, um, but much before October 7th. And I actually just finished reading Peter Beinart's newest book, where he talks about love for many Jews, love of Jerusalem and love of Israel is really a form of idolatry. And so this thing that many of us thought was so Jewish to love this country is actually breaking one of the Ten Commandments as a form of idolatry. And so and also I think, to your point, realizing that love that I felt really was highly manufactured, And I think once you understand that, um, it's sickening. And when I have returned to Jerusalem, I mean I can re-access that part of me, and I remember how I was feeling. Um, but like I had read, once you know what's going on, I don't think you can ever really unsee it and go back. But it's still it's a fraught relationship. I'm still obsessed with it, and I hope that someday I get to the point where I'm not as obsessed with it, because I can't think of anything that has defined my life so much than this idea of Zionism and a Jewish person's relationship to this land. And I think so much of my book is about what it means to let that go.
Do you think you could visit Israel anymore? I mean, would you be open to going there, or do you feel like it's just not not a place you'd like to visit anymore?
I would visit to visit my friends, especially my friends who can't come here. Um, I would, but it's difficult. Would you? I don't think you would.
No, you know, I would be fine right now at this point in time if I never went there again. The last time I was there was about a year ago for Passover, and it was a I only went because I was asked to go to participate in this action at the Gaza border where rabbis were bringing food supplies to protest the blockade of humanitarian aid. And um, I spent the time we stayed in a hostel in Tel Aviv, and I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I felt the ground shaking, from the bombs. I saw people in sidewalk cafes sipping their cappuccino, while this was going on, and um, I can't envision going back unless it was under perhaps a circumstance like that. Although I don't know that in the current political state of affairs, if that would even be possible. I often describe it as yeah, it was a love affair, but we had a really bad breakup, and I can't deal with my ex at all, at all. If, and it's
Yeah.
not, it's even, I wouldn't even refer to Israel as my ex because I think it was a manufactured love, as you put it. It's more like this feeling of having been duped for so many years.
Yeah, I mean there's a book that I quote extensively, which I can't of course can't think of the title right now, about the music industry in Israel, and how so much of the music creates this nostalgia. And when you talk to any young Jewish person who has gone on a trip, I mean so much of the music I think was also part of that for me, that kind of manufactured love. The complicated part is that it felt real. It felt like real love. And that's part of that pain is something that I was trying to get across through the stories in my book.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to interrogate a little bit more this issue of loving a country. It's one thing, I guess, for people who've grown up in a city or a country and have that personal history um, to profess love for place. I don't know if Joan Didion was born in New York City or not, but we'll give her a pass. Let's assume she did. But I so for those of us who, weren't even born in a place, but are sort of raised to love a place, that's one thing. But also, for people who have a personal connection to their own life experience to place, for people who have a connection to the so-called values of a country that they live in. I mean, what do you think about that? Is it possible to love a country, and what does that even mean?
I don't know, because I think so many of us are going through this right now in the United States with everything that's going on. I I at ETHS where I teach, I'm starting to teach All Quiet on the Western Front, and we talk a lot about how Remarque, the author, um, he loved his country, he loved Germany, but he had to leave because he wrote that book, and the book was not an anti-German book; it was an anti-war book. But he ended up being stripped of his citizenship. So, I mean, I think this question is is a is a very long standing question that I think many of us are dealing with now in the United States. I don't think I don't love Israel anymore. I'm angry. I'm hurt. I feel duped. I think it wasn't mine to love. And that's some of what I was also trying to get at in writing these essays. Was what it means to really disentangle yourself from the country, from an ideology, from this thing that has defined you. It defined me for decades.
Yeah, and what makes it, I think, additionally complex for Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, or Jews who have solidarity with Palestinians is that, I completely understand Palestinians' love for the land and for their country. And I think it's one thing to grow up with a kind of entitlement in a country, and another thing to be deprived of that. And that's a love that comes from a yearning for one's liberation into uh, their country. And so, I often say personally, I don't know how you feel about it. I'm not into flags really of any kind, any national flags. But I'm often at rallies where the Palestinian flag is being flown, and I'm fine with that because I understand it. It's not my flag, and even if I'm not someone who's into nationalism per se, I completely understand Palestinian nationalism and the kind of the place where that comes from. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about or any cognitive dissonance about it when it comes to Palestinians and their sense of connection and love for their land and
Yeah,
country.
and in fact, one of the essays was what actually when we were on the trip together in 2010, when we went with 20 Jewish people, and we went and spent time in Palestinian homes in the West Bank, um, and that I could see that there was this moment at night when I'm looking out the window, and I could just see the hills dotted with Palestinian homes, and I felt so strongly, perhaps for the first time, how much this land what was theirs and not mine. Um, but I agree with you about the flags. I mean, I also it's hard for me even with the Ukrainian flags, knowing that my family left Ukraine, having been persecuted. So I agree with what you're saying about the flag itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. My family, my father's side comes from the Ukraine, and yeah, they were left because of pogroms that were inflicted by the Ukrainians on
Right,
them.
right.
So yeah, that's another fraught kind of complex relationship to place. Uh, Although I will say, I went and visited the then Soviet Union. This was like 1990 or so. I was in rabbinical school, and I went with a friend who was also in rabbinical school, and his grandfather um, gave him a diagram of the village where he lived, and we were going to be staying very close to it, and we went and visited it, and it was not far from Kiev, where my grandmother is from, and I had a feeling, just knowing that I was in a land where my family was from. Um, I remember thinking at the time, and this was before I broke with Zionism, but I remember thinking consciously, I felt a different connection to that place than I did to Israel. Because I'm not Israeli. I don't have I don't have ancestral roots in that country. Uh, and it was the first time I really thought about my Jewish connection to place and starting to think deeply diaspora as Jewish homeland.
Yeah, I felt very similar. In fact, I quote you in one of the essays in the book towards the end of the book, my called my Russia Ukraine, where I talk about learning about my family from there, and for so long I didn't care because I cared about Israeli history, and so I actually feel that I missed out on understanding a lot of my family history from Eastern Europe because I didn't care about it growing up, um, and that was because of Zionism. I mean, I felt like I could draw a line from the beginning of the world to my relationship with Israel, and really nothing else mattered. And yet I've been reading these letters from my grandparents and understanding this, my roots are in Russia and Romania and Ukraine, um, and it was because of Zionism that I didn't care about it.
We might be related because I my grandfather's from Romania. Um, yeah. Well, there's a question in the chat. So why don't we move toward um, conversation? So this is from Cindy. How did you go about making decisions on which stories and experiences to include in the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I didn't include all of the essays that I had published about Israel Palestine. So I took the ones that were the most meaningful to me, and then kind of like with an album, I tried to figure out the order, and I changed the order several times, and I'm really happy with the way it is now. But I wanted pieces that were going to, like, I wanted a piece from when I was at summer camp growing up, the camp I went to in Michigan. I wanted a piece about my very first trip. I wanted a piece about when I was actually living in Jerusalem as a grad student. And there are several of the pieces are, about that time. And I wanted a piece about later, or even subsequent visits going back to Israel, Palestine, bringing my husband there. So uh, I wanted to kind of represent my life, in the best way that I could.
Thanks. If there are others who have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. Just click on React and raise your hand. But in the meantime, we were Liz and I were chatting before the session, and Liz commented that this was all written before October 7th, 2023, and definitely reflects, the time in which it was written. But I would love to know, Liz, if you were writing about an essay now or writing about the current moment, how would that book, how would that essay be different?
Yeah, I think I would be focusing on what's happening in Gaza, what that feels like to be happening in our name as Jews. Um, I think some of the essays that I wrote up to like 10 years ago, I was a lot angrier, and I think I've grown up a little bit and have come to understand that Zionism and anti-Zionism is kind of this whole spectrum, and that it means different things to different people. And I think, years ago, I would, get in a fight with someone. Well, are you an anti-Zionist or not? And it was kind of like, you either are or you're not. You're either a Zionist or you're not. And I think that I've come to understand that these things mean different things to different people, and that's okay. And I think especially given um, the indoctrination that happens with this ideology, that with this nationalism of Zionism, that it's difficult to untangle. So I think I would maybe write about that with a little bit more compassion than I had for people and for myself at the time. Um, it's also really difficult to write about something like separating from an ideology that takes a lot of time because we have a sense of urgency because people are dying. And I think I have always struggled with that tension. I imagine I would still be struggling with it if I were to write it today.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think my writing has gotten progressively angrier since October 7th.
Understandable.
Yeah. Yeah, whatever vestiges may have been there have been just irrevocably torn, I think. But at any rate, we have a question here from Leo. Did you receive any pushback or support from ETHS or Northwestern for expressing your anti-Zionism? ETHS grad here, though I never had the privilege to be your student.
Oh, thank you. Um, I have not received pushback. Well, there have been some parents who have not wanted their kids in my class over the years. Really, just a few. I have great relationships with Jewish Zionist kids at my school, and I think the reason is because I understand their where they're at. And so I actually have really good relationships. I have not received any pushback at Northwestern. Um, I don't have a political agenda in my classroom at ETHS. And I think some of my colleagues do. I've really tried to, rather than imposing my views on my students, provide a space for them to figure out where they are, because we're at school for them. And then have my own supports, with people that I can process things with. I did get a very threatening text message though from a guy that I knew in Jerusalem, who had heard about the book, and uh, he's very Zionist, moved from Canada, made Aliyah, went to the army. Um, so that was a disappointment, but I guess not that surprising.
You know, you used to, I remember when you taught Hebrew at, was it Niles North High
Yeah.
School, which was probably a different kind of experience, though, right?
It was very different, and I was in the process of disentangling Zionism from Judaism as a Hebrew teacher, and so I think I became a very bad Hebrew teacher for a while, and I had to really kind of separate myself from the Hebrew language and then return to it with language about the occupation and about what was happening, I think, as a way to love the language again. Um, but yeah, it's ironic that that I was teaching Hebrew because I was also teaching it with other teachers who taught it in a public school like it was Hebrew school. So, and there's like, separation of church and state issues, and are we going to, light the menorah and dance around when we're at a public school, and in Hebrew school and a public school kind of becomes like a Hebrew homeroom for students. It was a strange time. I wrote an essay about that, and I did decide that to leave that one out of the book.
Yeah, the politics of teaching Hebrew at public schools is really troubling. I mean, they
Yeah,
taught Hebrew. There was a Hebrew class for many years at Evanston Township, and when I was a rabbi in Evanston, um, I would get pressure to recruit students from my synagogue to take the class when numbers were down. And there was a strong Jewish communal agenda at Jewish high schools in Jewish areas uh, to teach Hebrew, and kind of really troubling accusations made against non-support of Hebrew in public schools. So
yeah.
that was an interesting time for me. Uh, let's see. Deborah has a question. Can you talk more about your relationship to Hebrew? How important was Zionist belief to your actually learning the language? Has your leaving Zionism impacted on your relationship to the language?
Yeah, so like I was saying, I had I as I was learning to separate Judaism and Zionism, I really had to take a break from Hebrew. And it was actually through a friend, an Israeli friend who was also anti-Zionist, um, and was living in Paris. And we had joked that we should write an Israeli textbook for Jewish students who are not Zionists so that they could talk about the occupation and really learn the language um, through anti-Zionism. We never did that, but I would still love to do it someday because and and honestly, being part of Tzedek Chicago and hearing the Hebrew at holidays um, by by Brandt and by other people who are not Zionists has helped me kind of learn how to re-love the language again. I mean, when I learned that I was teaching, I loved teaching first and second year Hebrew. And then when I realized that Hebrew is what Palestinians are hearing at checkpoints when they're being stopped, I just was horrified. And I really had to take a step back.
Yeah, I have a similarly complex relationship with the Hebrew language too, but also trying to separate the ways that Hebrew has been appropriated by Zionism and Hebrew words that may have had one meaning before Zionism came along that now have completely transformed meanings as a result of the reality. And the word Israel is probably the most classic example that, if you ask most people what the word Yisrael means, they would say it refers to a nation state in the Middle East. And for centuries it meant the Jewish people. And so there's a myriad of those examples that I'm constantly, and I'll trying to point out to folks that um, we can't let them take this language away from us. We need to reclaim it on some level.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about, because you referred to some of your Israeli friends, the way that friends and individuals in Israel impact on your relationship with Israel as a place or Zionism as an ideology? Have you been able to maneuver through um, still having relationships, positive relationships with Israeli friends, even if your relationship with Israel itself has fallen apart? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, several of them ended, and several of my relationships with American Jews ended. Um, One of my best friends is an American who had made Aliyah 30 years ago, and I met him at Hebrew University when we were both grad students, and we have stayed very close. And I don't know if it's because we really love each other or because he's open-minded. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but he has stayed my friend through this, huge trajectory that I have been on. And he's probably one of the very few people that I can talk about my views with and know that he's not, he's proud of being a Zionist. Um, and we've been able to stay friends. I don't have a ton of Israeli friends who are Jewish now. I mean, I still have I have some Palestinian friends who live there who I'm very close to. My Armenian friend who is, featured prominently in the book. I'm still close to. Um, it's tricky. It's tricky because it makes me sad about some of these relationships that ended, but I mean, I don't know, relationships end and I think the ones that persevere, I'm grateful for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I much of my indoctrination, I'll put it, into Zionism was a result of some friends who I knew when I was in college and as an undergraduate who were on their way to moving to Israel. They were in Hashomer Hatzair. Which is a socialist Zionist youth movement, and they were moving to kibbutz. And I lived in a big house with them when I was in college, and I ended up going to Israel too on a different kind of program. But they had a strong impact on me, and almost all of them I don't have a relationship anymore with, except for one who I think is probably pretty politically aligned with us. Uh, um, and when I visited, he was visiting Chicago a few years ago, and um, I had coffee with him and was really, really dreading talking to him because we hadn't talked in years. And he just said, I follow your writing. I know I follow what you've been up to. And I was like, oh. And he said, I just want you to know I'm really proud of what you're doing. And I really, I agree with you. And it meant a lot to me that I could maintain that one relationship. He's probably the only is Israeli friend from that period of my life where I still have a relationship. Everyone else voluntarily opted out of a relationship with me once they learned what I was up to. But
Yeah.
I think this business of loving a country has something to do with people, as well, and that's what makes it so complicated.
Yeah, and I think that when when the last time I was in Israel, Palestine, and in the cafes in Tel Aviv, and seeing how this uh, the way that Israelis can live, um, and many of them not be bothered, and they admit it. I mean, they love, their coffee shops, and kind of living like Europeans. Um, but I actually, when this event was sent out, I got an email from a woman who I didn't go to Hashomer Tzaira, but I went to Habonim, which is also an essay in the book, um, a camp in Michigan, and I got an email from a woman who I had not talked to in decades, and she said she didn't know how she was on the Tzedek Chicago list, but she saw that I'd published this book, and she was really happy, and she had wondered if there were other people who had gone to Habonim who had also, started to separate Zionism from Judaism. And it was amazing, amazing to hear from her.
Yeah, the camp, the Midwestern camp, Camp Tavor was the one you went to.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean there. I don't know if you've been following what's been going on with the young people at Tavor, but the Israel component of it is let's just say is not resonating. The socialist part is, the
yeah.
Zionist part is not. Um,
Well, somebody, the person who was running the camp a few years ago emailed me randomly. I didn't know her. She emailed me to my high school email and said that she wanted me to know that the essay, this was before the book, but the essays in the book about camp was printed out and pasted up on the bathroom walls. And, and she just wanted me to know. And she said that she was having some trouble being the Roche of the camp, and could we talk? And I was happy to talk. She ended up not following through, but I've heard that they're going through, they're kind of having an identity crisis. Yeah.
that is awesome. That when you get the pages of your book posted on a bathroom wall, that is really cool.
Yeah.
So subversive. That's what every writer should aspire to. Um, yeah, is there anyone else who has any questions they'd like? I mean, I would be very happy to continue chit-chatting with Liz for the next 10 minutes or so. But if there's anyone who'd like to ask a question, either in the chat or by raising your hand, please feel free.
I will say though too about this idea of a relationship to place, that and I've talked about this with my Israeli friend, that I don't if I had been born in Israel and had gone through the army, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how I would be. And I don't know if I would be one of the people who refuses to serve or part of breaking the silence. I don't know. And that's why in my book, I very much was trying to just speak from my perspective as an American Jew. Because I don't know what it would have been like to live there. I mean, it's
Yeah. Yeah, we would have to join the army. We'd have children who would be raised to be soldiers. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I considered moving there at one time in my life when I was young, and I often think about that question as well. Anita has a question, and then Emmy has a question.
I do. Thanks, Rabbi. Actually, as much a comment as a question. Liz, it's so good to be in this space with you. I really appreciate learning about your book. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to read Judith Butler's book. I have a certain relationship with Judith Butler's books, and I think your book is a really good pairing with her book. It's because it's so accessible and personal, and I really appreciate it. I just want to thank you for that and call that out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anita. Um, Emmy asks, wondering about your thoughts about the relationship or distinction between loving a country and loving a place or a cultural region.
I mean, I think unfortunately, for many Jews, those things get very very messy. And I mean, for me, I've been trying to separate out, to understand where my family really did come from, um, to learn about that place, to reconcile, the United States that we're living in now. I think. th- I don't know how to answer that. I think these are all very difficult things that I think many of us are grappling with, especially today.
Yeah, I can think of, I can speaking for myself, Emmy. When I was in Israel, I, I think my deepest connection was not so much to Israeli culture, because, like it wasn't really, I wasn't raised with it. And, Israeli rock and roll was just like a pale comparison of American, and a lot of the Israeli cultures, it felt foreign to me. But where I felt, so it wasn't cultural, but it was, I did feel like I was falling in love with the place. I loved I lived in the Arava Desert, which is in the southern Negev, the southern part of the country, just north of Eilat, the southernmost tip. And I lived on a tiny little kibbutz in the middle of the desert and got up at 4 in the morning to pick tomatoes. And this was for a long time. I was doing this, and I felt at the time I really loved this place. For instance, what Liz said about Jerusalem. I remember the first time when I went to Jerusalem, and when I was a kid with my family and saw the sunset golden, you know, stones of Jerusalem, and our Israeli relative said, "This is why it's called Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of gold," and it was like right there in front of me, and it was just I remember just being so moved by that, um, and now I've long since, I think, put to bed the what that love really meant. And I think it was, to use Liz's term, manufactured love. I think it was a result of a ideology that told me that I had some entitlement to this place. And the love kind of came organically out of that. It didn't emerge in an honest way. And I'll never, there are many beautiful places in the world. I'd love to visit them. I spent so many times flying back and forth to Israel. I wish I could, I'd spend as much time in other places that have just as beautiful places to visit, and I don't necessarily have to feel entitled to, but just go there to enjoy them. And you know,
Yeah, I think the problem though too is that the relationships were real, and I forged these relationships that were still are deeply meaningful to me with real human beings, and that's part of how all of this is so complicated. I think when you're disentangling from an ideology. But I agree with you, Brant. That's a really good point. I did not have a lot of Israeli friends. I could not relate to their experiences of they went to university after their years in the army. They were older. They all went home on the weekends. And so my closest friends became other people who were kind of misfits like me living in another country, more than Israelis themselves.
Yeah, I'll just have Deborah has her hand up. But it's one really quickly. I want to do a shout out to my wife Hallie because when I was in Israel, my then girlfriend Hallie was there as well, and she wasn't falling in love as much as I was. She was having an interesting year abroad and was gonna look, gonna go back home. And she always said, "I felt like a foreigner in this country, and." I don't want, if you want to move here, you're welcome to it, but I don't want to be an immigrant and have, in a foreign country and have my kids make fun of my accent and always feel like I'm kind of not really part of things. And um, yeah, thank God I followed her back home is all I can say. So shout out to Hallie Rosen. Deborah,
Yeah, just a quick comment as we're ending, and I love that about Hallie. Thanks for sharing that. I just the Jerusalem of Gold song, just my one and only experience as a kind of lifelong raised by anti-Zionists. I did make one trip to Israel, Palestine, and the people who encouraged me to do that were both Israelis and Palestinians who said, "Just come and see this mess. You need to see it." And I have to say, despite and I actually met those people in the Soviet Union. So that kind of gives you an idea of where I was coming from. And I went to those places, and there was something intriguing about, I'm kind of almost embarrassed to admit it, but there was something intriguing about not being like a minority. There was just something intriguing about seeing so many Jewish people in one space as opposed to my upbringing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So there was something about that. And then and I don't know any Hebrew, and I heard that song, and I heard a version of it by I think somebody named Shuli Natan, or an Israeli singer, and I thought it was so beautiful. I loved that song. And then this Israeli friend of mine said, "Deborah, you don't understand about that song." And so thoroughly disabused me of the beauty of that song. And so when I read about it in your book, it was a funny memory. Thank you,
Yeah,
Lynn, for this book.
yeah. Thank you, thank you. It got under my skin. I mean, yeah, boy,
it's the perfect metaphor because it is a really beautiful song
it is. It
and it
is.
does get under your skin and it's insidious at the same time.
Yeah.
So, so we have one final question. Where is your book available to check out or purchase?
So the book is available from the publisher Querencia. It is also available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. If you Google my name in the book, you'll find it in multiple places.
Great. Well, and that brings us to the hour. So, wow, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for participating. Really appreciate your presence. And yeah, we'll continue to be having this conversation in many different ways, I know, in the future. So thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.